Hey, what's up guys? Mikey here. Teachers, right? Teachers are very important in other people's lives, so it's just as important if teachers treat their students well. In my whole life, I've only ever had 3 teachers that I've absolutely dreaded asking for help if I ever got stuck on something because they were kinda harsh about that. But they also never took away a good noodle star from me if I ever was stuck or something, so take that for what it's worth.
New Student Starfish is the episode where SpongeBob brings Patrick to boating school with him, and they cause disruptions which gets SpongeBob in trouble. This episode aired on September 20th, 2002, and is the episode that ruined the numbers 24 and especially 25 for everybody on Earth.
24!
25.
And as a result, this episode has been made quite memorable for just that reason alone. In this one, the boating school is depicted with halls, lockers, and so on, with this being the second and one of the only times where it's been shown like this. The first being episode 86, The Bully from season 3. The last time where something other than just a single classroom for the boating school is shown, as far as I remember, is this blinking you'll miss it shot and brief clip of the bathroom in episode 213, Boating Buddies from season 6. This episode also shows 2 sets of staircases, the only time the boating school is depicted as having more than 1 floor at all. Now as I expected, this episode is famous for the 25 line, and rightfully so. I always remember that when I was a kid, but there was a little something that stuck with me a bit more and kind of made an impact on how I view this episode. Which, as usual, I will share right after we watch this episode and see what else it has to be considered worthy. So the episode starts up and Gary helps SpongeBob get ready for boating school. After a brief launching sequence, SpongeBob misses the bullseye on the target that Gary draws and is about to leave when Patrick arrives. SpongeBob says he has to go to school, which makes Patrick upset because he feels lonely when SpongeBob's gone all day. SpongeBob gets an idea to bring Patrick to school with him, which Patrick agrees to. Later on, they arrive at Mrs. Puff's boating school and SpongeBob shows Patrick all the learning destinations at school. SpongeBob said that class didn't start till 9, but it was only 6:20 a.m.
I am a night owl, and that time is a death sentence.
SpongeBob showed Patrick Mrs. Puff's classroom and showed the board with good noodle stars, which are earned for good behavior. Patrick remarked on how many good noodle stars that SpongeBob had and felt anxious, and SpongeBob said he had
74.
Okay, first, if you look closely enough, there's only 25 good noodle stars instead of 74. And second, that's an awful lot of good noodle stars for somebody who can't get his driver's license to save his life.
SpongeBob showed Patrick Roger, who was a baby chick in an egg kept inside a terrarium, kept warm by a light bulb, which is imperative to keeping Roger alive. SpongeBob and Patrick sit down and are very excited for class to start in a couple hours. When class starts, Mrs. Puff notices new Student Starfish and asks him to introduce himself, but Patrick gets anxious and stutters like crazy until he utters out 24. The class guffaws like crazy and Mrs. Puff was annoyed. Patrick sits down awkwardly and Mrs. Puff tries to start the first lesson, but SpongeBob and Patrick start snickering over the number
25.
which gets Mrs. Puff angry. She lets Patrick off with a warning, but is more angry with SpongeBob. As she tries to continue her lesson, Patrick draws her and calls her a big fat meanie, which Mrs. Puff sees.
As if I really look like this!
Oh crap, that's hard to look at.
Mrs. Puff thinks SpongeBob drew that and punishes him by taking away a good noodle star, the result of 2 classroom disruptions.
Why only 2 disruptions? Why not 3?
SpongeBob throws a huge tantrum, but that doesn't change Mrs. Puff's mind on taking away the star. After that disruption, Mrs. Puff makes SpongeBob move to the desk in the back of the room. He goes there, very unhappy with Patrick. When he sits there, he can't hear Mrs. Puff very well and is shocked by all the graffiti in the corner. Patrick tries to get his attention, but SpongeBob just tries to ignore him. After shooting a bunch of spitballs, he just says hi, which makes SpongeBob shout back, right in front of Mrs. Puff.
Mrs. Puff immediately noticed SpongeBob shouting at the back of the class, but not Patrick turned around standing on his chair whispering in the front of the class.
Out in the hallway, SpongeBob snaps at Patrick for everything he did that got him in trouble. Patrick got frustrated too, and a crowd formed around them telling them to fight. So they do, but then it becomes embarrassing and the other students leave. Mrs. Puff breaks up the awkward fight and sentences the both of them to detention. much to both of their shocks. After school, SpongeBob and Patrick sat at opposite corners of the room and went back and forth on how much they hate each other. And conveniently, the light bulb keeping Roger warm and alive burned out. They both started to get anxious, and as Roger kept visibly getting colder and colder, they both broke down and apologized.
Patrick's the only one who needed to apologize.
They both worked together to save Roger. Patrick went to the supply closet to get a new light bulb, which was all that was in the closet, but he only noticed the lit one at the top.
Really?
SpongeBob tries keeping Roger warm while Patrick climbed up the mountain to get the lit light bulb. On his way back, SpongeBob and Patrick bumped into each other and lost control of Roger and the light bulb. They both caught them and replaced the bulb just in time. Mrs. Puff saw the whole thing from behind her one-way chalkboard and was proud of them for working together. She decided to give them each a gold star, but wasn't sure what saving an egg has to do with boating school.
Same here. I wonder why that egg was in boating school at all.
Patrick realized he was in boating school and not Spanish class, so he left, and then Roger hatched safe and sound, and the episode ends. So that was New Student Starfish, and I have quite a few things to say about that one. I do think it's a good episode, but it does have a few questionable aspects to it in my opinion. Let's start off by talking about what I said earlier, something that affected me as a kid. The thing that stuck with me the most when I was young was the image of Mrs. Puff looking like the big fat meanie drawing.
As if I really look like this.
That startled me a lot back in the day, and for a long time, whenever I watched it on TV, I would either turn and look away, or I would get up and walk away so that I'm not looking at the TV, and wait for that visual to go away before immediately going to sit back down when it's gone. I didn't necessarily get nightmares from it, but I didn't really want to look at it for a while. The line of dialogue is okay for me, but not the visual. Nowadays, I can watch it without getting up from my seat, but sometimes I do squint while looking at it. It's not as bad as the close-up of the butterfly from episode 50, Wormy from season 2, that scared me and a lot of other kids that I covered my ears when watching it back then, and sometimes even nowadays. But the big fat meanie shot is one of the rare moments of SpongeBob that affected me a lot that I actively squint or cover my ears when I go back and rewatch it. So that's my excuse for the day as to why I was affected by this episode when I was young. Now looking at the episode for what it actually is, there are a lot of good things I like. I like the sequence at the beginning with SpongeBob and Gary. The part where SpongeBob and Patrick are fighting, in quotation marks, is pretty funny. I like when they both apologize and work together pretty quickly to save Roger when they're in detention. And I like when Patrick says he just waits for SpongeBob to return while he's at school. That's cute. Patrick hiking up the light bulb pile to get the only one that's lit up is such a Patrick thing to do. It's funny. I like that this episode introduces the Good Noodle Star board, and Roger's a cool guy. This episode also has a good moral about how best friends sitting next to each other in class isn't always the best idea. It can be fun for sure, but they can clearly cause classroom disruptions, which is clearly demonstrated here. I remember sitting next to girls I had a crush on at the time in 8th grade or high school, but I was good at not causing disruptions by talking to her while the teacher was talking. I was okay with controlling my crush and just acting like a friend around the girl in question and didn't cause classroom disruptions like in this episode. I can still relate to this one for other reasons though. SpongeBob's tantrum over getting a Good Noodle Star removed gave me flashbacks to a couple different tantrums I threw in different classes on a couple different occasions throughout my years before I turned 20. It's a little upsetting being reminded of that, so I'm moving on. I appreciate the moral of being careful when sitting next to your best friends in class though. On a more positive note, I learned what detention is from this episode, instead of getting in trouble in school and learning about it that way. Even though I did get in trouble, and of course, I am also ruined by that number that's more funny than 24.
25.
That's probably one of the jokes I've heard most of the time when I randomly bring up SpongeBob when I share that to people I'm getting to know more for the first time. Now, there are a couple of weird things here. For a couple of nitpicky things that don't matter, I wonder why they went in depth on the hallway and lockers and stuff when we really don't see them again in the future. Roger being the reason why SpongeBob and Patrick make up their quarrel is a bit odd since a baby chick in a terrarium in boating school is strange. But this episode already addressed that with Mrs. Puff's line, so I'll give it a pass. But something that's not really a nitpick, my biggest issue is how SpongeBob is treated. He was blamed for Patrick's drawing, and he got in trouble for his shouting here when Patrick shot like a dozen spitballs at him. Like, I know Patrick was whispering here, but how does Mrs. Puff not notice Patrick at the front of the class turned around trying to get SpongeBob's attention, yet she does notice SpongeBob shouting from the back of the class? I feel sorry for SpongeBob throughout most of this, even though his tantrum is a bit much here. He didn't do anything to deserve getting his favorite Good Noodle star removed. But I could say it could be worse. Patrick could have cracked another joke and SpongeBob would have been blamed for it, making the situation just mean-spirited to an extent. For me, the tantrum is the low point of the episode. Not just because SpongeBob is innocent, but mostly because it's loud and goes on for too long. I wouldn't say this episode is mean-spirited. It's fine. It's not too bad. I think some people over-exaggerate these scenes. I'm not the absolute biggest fan of it either, but not for the same reasons. Just the personal ones I mentioned earlier. This episode is fine. There are quite a few things that redeem it, like all the stuff I mentioned earlier. I like the back and forth dialogue of SpongeBob and Patrick saying how much they hate each other. That's not mean-spirited. That's just typical kids getting into a typical schoolyard fight. Nothing extreme by any stretch of the imagination. And I really like the whole sequence of SpongeBob and Patrick working together to save Roger for a lot of reasons. This is a pretty good episode, I'd say. It has a balance of popular memes and slightly less good things compared to the best things of the show so far. I'm usually good at shutting my brain off to enjoy SpongeBob episodes, and when I do that and forget about the past moments I mentioned, I really like this episode a lot. And thank God we don't see Roger shoehorned into the modern day show every other episode. That would be so annoying.
New Student Starfish is a good episode. While there are some questionable parts about it, there are also a lot of redeeming factors about it too, so it's far from the worst episode. I think it's a bit overhated by those who do hate it. It has a good moral and a lot of funny sequences, so it's hard to complain about it too much, you know? But speaking of complaining, we never got to find out something that was funnier than 25 in that episode, and something else worth complaining about. Right now, it's really dark and cold outside, and there's no place near me where I can go clam fishing and wear my clam fishing hat.
Clams is the episode where Mr. Krabs earns his $1 million and takes SpongeBob and Squidward on a clam fishing trip, but he loses his dollar to a giant clam. Like New Student Starfish, this episode aired on September 20th, 2002, and is the last episode of the show to air in the year 2002. This is one of the show's many parodies of popular movies, with this one being of everybody's favorite Steven Spielberg film, Jaws, with the title card, the dramatic orchestrated music throughout, and with the characters taking on roles of the characters from the movie. Nickelodeon really seems to like Jaws parodies, as a couple years later, there was the Jimmy Neutron episode, Monster Hunt, where Jimmy, Carl, and Sheen try to find a lake monster, and the Rocko's Modern Life episode, Fishin' Chums, from the 90s. Now this episode stuck with me a bit more than New Student Starfish, and for a lot more positive reasons compared to the former. So before we get into that, let's watch this episode and see how SpongeBob parodies Jaws. So the episode starts up and Sandals is trying to order something from the menu, but Squidward isn't making it easy. SpongeBob suggests the coral bits, which are only $1. When Squidward gets handed the dollar, a siren goes off and an orchestra starts playing. Mr. Krabs comes out of the bathroom, grabs the dollar, and rubs his ass with it. Mr. Krabs explains to everybody that this dollar in particular was his 1,000,000th dollar, which was the goal of everybody in the Krabs' family. Mr. Krabs thanks the customer, but kicks everybody out so he can be alone with the dollar.
And the customer, Sandals, never got his coral bits. No wonder Mr. Krabs is so hated these days.
Mr. Krabs was thankful for SpongeBob and Squidward for how they helped him make his $1 million that he decided to take them on a trip as a reward. They were both very excited, and while Squidward guessed all the possibilities of where they could go, they ended up going clam fishing, which he wasn't too happy about since it wasn't exciting like all the other places he mentioned.
Honestly, I haven't gone fishing since high school, so I'd be excited to go fishing just for that alone.
Squidward just sat down to relax while SpongeBob got ready to cast. When he started, he grabbed a lot of stuff on the boat and flung it out to sea, including Squidward's nose. Mr. Krabs thought the sight was funny, but also told Squidward to try to just go with the flow. And while SpongeBob was continuing to cast random shit out, he also cast out Mr. Krabs' $1 million. And shortly after, Mr. Krabs heard some music that meant death if a sailor hears it. As SpongeBob reeled in the dollar, Mr. Krabs found the orchestra playing the music, but they wouldn't stop playing it no matter how much he begged.
Well, why did he bring the orchestra on the boat in the first place?
SpongeBob reeled in the dollar just in time, but then a new music started and the dollar was eaten by a giant blue-lipped clam. Mr. Krabs started crying uncontrollably about losing his $1 million. Squidward was telling Mr. Krabs to stop crying, but he wouldn't no matter how many times he said so, until Squidward finally agreed to help him get the dollar back. Mr. Krabs was happy and grabbed the serious clam fishing supplies. Later, SpongeBob and Squidward waited with the fishing poles while Mr. Krabs kept a lookout for old Blue Lips. After 3 days of nothing, Squidward and even SpongeBob were tired of just waiting. So Squidward decided to give Mr. Krabs his dollar back, which was just one of Squidward's own dollars, and SpongeBob agreed.
I don't know what's more surprising, the fact that SpongeBob agreed to trick Mr. Krabs, or the fact that Squidward used one of his own dollars instead of one of SpongeBob's.
They gave Mr. Krabs the dollar, and he believed it at first, but it didn't take too long for it to realize that it wasn't his. Mr. Krabs felt like his crew betrayed him and started to cry until Squidward made him stop. So Mr. Krabs said that he would offer a reward, a single sandwich nailed to a post, and dumped all the remaining food off the boat, not letting them eat until they get the dollar back.
Some reward.
SpongeBob and Squidward sneak off to the side and realize how insane Mr. Krabs has become. So they try to sneak away, not very well though since they got caught. Mr. Krabs tied them up and resorted to one last way to get the clam to come back. Live bait. And this time, he knew that old Blue Lips would come back because he started playing the music this time.
Oh, that's why he brought the orchestra on the boat in the first place.
Old Blue Lips showed up, and as he opened his mouth, Mr. Krabs stopped the music so the clam froze in midair, and he got his dollar back. Then the music played again, so Mr. Krabs got eaten, and the orchestra was done. SpongeBob and Squidward thought Mr. Krabs was gone forever. But soon he survived the fight, revealing that he and the clam settled on a trade. Mr. Krabs traded most of his body for the dollar, and the episode ends. So that was Clams, and this is a pretty good episode, I'd say. My favorite aspect of this episode is the tone. It feels more adventurous because most of the episode takes place on the boat, and more than half of it involves the characters trying to hunt down old Blue Lips. The fact it takes place on a visually different set than most episodes of the show gives it more of a dramatic tone that makes this one stand out to me compared to New Student Starfish, a boating school episode that actually doesn't have anything to do with SpongeBob taking his boating exam, or even some other episodes from this season that are still good, don't get me wrong, but are regular Krusty Krab or Best Buddy episodes. The tone alone made this episode more memorable for me than the previous one. I really like the Jaws type music that plays during the scenes that heavily involve the clam and dollar. It really helps set the mood. I'd say the orchestra is one of my favorite uses of the live action cutaways in the whole show. I like the meta gag where Mr. Krabs notices the music playing and tells the orchestra to stop. And it's cool and funny how that clam is basically cued in because of the music. There are a lot of funny gags in this episode. I love the part with SpongeBob and the coral blue lipstick.
Actually, it's coral blue number 2.
I love when SpongeBob was casting various things off the ship. It was always really funny to me. I like the different visual gags of Mr. Krabs crying, every shot where he was dancing with the dollar, and the blinking you'll miss it shot of Gary eating the couch. That never worked when I tried it though.
How did he do it?
I like how the characters are portrayed for the most part. I like how Mr. Krabs immediately wanted to take SpongeBob and Squidward on a trip as a reward for helping him reach $1 million. You would not see that these days. I like how Squidward is visually upset for Mr. Krabs in this shot when Mr. Krabs explains what happens, and how he is the one who agrees to help Mr. Krabs get the dollar back instead of SpongeBob volunteering for both of them. It's nice to see SpongeBob agreeing with Squidward on how Mr. Krabs was treating them while trying to get his dollar back. Again, these days, SpongeBob would either intentionally disagree or he would just be too blind to the truth. I like how he's actually willing to not just let Mr. Krabs keep them stuck out there. His agreeing to trick Mr. Krabs with a regular dollar is a great character moment in my opinion. I have heard some people say Mr. Krabs is just an evil dictator when it comes to how he treated SpongeBob and Squidward, and I both agree and disagree. On the one hand, the worst of him was only brought out when SpongeBob and Squidward tried to trick him or escape after promising to help him. However, the fact he kept them out there for 3 days and soon got rid of all food but a single sandwich, I would say that's going a bit too far, but I can overlook it. Being stuck out there for days staring at the same thing over and over is bound to make anybody go insane. Surely at least one of them could have tried something different instead of just standing at the top of the boat trying to find old blue lips. I can understand why Mr. Krabs was sad about losing something he cherished deeply, but some of the actions to get them back weren't very necessary, like the live bait. But like I said, he only got to that point because SpongeBob and Squidward broke their promise to him. Couple that with his downward spiral of pretty much everything about him at this point, I would say everything that got to this point is fine. And he still stopped the clan from eating SpongeBob and Squidward at all, so I think some people are overreacting to this. I wouldn't say this is mean-spirited per se. In my opinion, Mr. Krabs as an antagonist works here better than something like episode 77, Jellyfish Hunter from season 2, where his actions involve abusing the poor jellyfish and intentionally causing them pain. He made sure to not have SpongeBob and Squidward physically get hurt, just hungry. I'd argue the jellyfish example is worse than this one any day. And this isn't a greedy scheme to try to make more money for himself. This is just getting back something that was taken from him that meant a lot to him. But I do still like his downward spiral to get to insanity. I really like this episode. This is one of the better episodes of Mr. Krabs being the main villain in my opinion. And he got some comeuppance at the end, so hey, even better. Oh wait, I forgot. He did kick everybody out of the Krusty Krab just because he had made his $1 million. I take back everything I said. He's garbage. I really liked SpongeBob and Squidward working together throughout the episode when Mr. Krabs is pushing them too hard. Both of these guys are strong here. Squidward willing to cooperate with SpongeBob when Mr. Krabs is running them ragged, and SpongeBob actually agreeing that Mr. Krabs has gone insane and is driving them crazy. Despite what some people say about Mr. Krabs in this episode, I really like all the characters in this one. The fact that this episode is more adventurous than the previous episode made this one stick out to me more than just another episode where SpongeBob and Patrick have a fight. It's a really fun adventure episode, and the Jaws-like tone is done really well here. This one is pretty cool all around, and it's good to go back and watch from time to time. Even this guy didn't get a reward for giving Mr. Krabs his $1 million, damn it.
What?
Clams is a great episode. I love the atmospheric tone that makes this one stand out a bit more from other good episodes this season, and I like the gradual transformation of all the characters in this one, even if some are for the worse and not the better. I can see how some people may think this one is a bit rough, but it's far from horrible if you ask me. It's still funny, so it has that going for it. And besides, it's about clam fishing. Those 3 rough teachers I had back in the day never mentioned clams, fishing, or even clam fishing once in any of the classes they taught.